Keir Starmer tells all of their MPs, whether they're frontbenchers or backbenchers, what to say and what to think and how to vote. The Labour Party has been drifting closer and closer to the Conservatives in terms of policies over the last few years. Many people across the country, but I can speak from my experience speaking to voters in Bristol, are done with the Labour Party. You know, the UK is one of only 2 countries in Europe that uses first past the post for general elections, and the other one is Belarus. Now, that's hardly a club that we want to be part of. The Greens are clear that a fair voting system is an integral part of a fair society, and we would push the incoming Labour government to look at that very seriously.
Carla Denyer, welcome to PoliticsJOE. If anyone's not familiar with who you are, how would you like to introduce yourself?
My name's Carla Denyer. I'm co-leader nationally of the Green Party of England and Wales, along with my colleague Adrian Ramsey, and I'm the Green Party's parliamentary candidate in the new constituency of Bristol Central.
You are trying to win in Bristol Central up against shadow frontbencher Thangam Debbonaire. So let's talk about your experience of winning things. Tell me about something else you've won in the past.
Well, I've been elected several times as a councillor. I was a councillor for 9 years on Bristol City Council, and in that time I was able to achieve a fair amount of change for a opposition councillor. So I was the author of the Climate Emergency Declaration in Bristol. It was the first such declaration anywhere in Europe, and while I didn't see this coming in advance at all, it set off somewhat of a tidal wave of similar declarations. Almost every council in the UK, plus many other organisations, have now followed suit, being honest about the fact that we are in a climate emergency, and when you're in an emergency, that means we need to do things differently. Many of those declarations also came with ambitious carbon reduction targets, and so in a small way I have contributed to the UK accelerating its progress on tackling climate change. However, because the Greens were not until recently in the administration on Bristol City Council, we didn't have the power to make those policy decisions to actually accelerate the progress directly ourselves. That's changed. The Greens are now running Bristol City Council, and next up is our target to get more Green MPs elected in the House of Commons so that we can carry on that work at a national level. I
believe the party's targeting 4 candidates, 4 potential MPs. Let's hone in on your contest. We mentioned Thangam Debbonaire, shadow frontbencher, high-profile opposition candidate for you. How are you feeling about the contest? Are you confident?
I think it would be foolish for any political candidate to say they were confident in an election, but I'm certainly optimistic. Bristol Central is a very green area. We now have, across the whole of the city of Bristol, we have 34 Green Party councillors. That's the largest group of Green councillors that's ever existed anywhere in the UK. We're now running Bristol City Council, so that's the largest Green-led council in the UK. And in the constituency I'm standing, we have all 14 out of 14 councillors now Green. Now, I know that local and general elections are different, but to be honest, when we speak to voters, when they are voting differently locally and generally, in some constituencies, it's because they think the Greens can't get in nationally. But voters in Bristol Central know that that's not the case, because it is a Labour-Green marginal seat. The Conservatives and the Lib Dems are absolutely nowhere in the constituency. There's no possibility of them getting in locally or nationally. Nationally, it's clear the Conservatives are on their way out of government. The Tories are toast, as Owen Jones said, and so we have the opportunity to get a handful of Greens elected in seats like Bristol Central and our other 3 target seats across a wide variety of different geographies and demographics, and that means that with the incoming Labour government we can get that team of Green MPs in there to push them to be bolder on the areas that they're not so strong on. And that is what voters in Bristol are telling me they're excited about, the possibility of electing a Green MP who shares their values and will not shy away from arguing for the right thing in Westminster.
If the argument goes that the constituency can have influence on the governing party by electing you, surely by electing someone who will go into government, who will be a frontbencher, they'll have more influence on a Labour government by having a Labour cabinet minister representing them.
The thing about the Labour Party is that they whip all of their elected representatives, which means that Keir Starmer tells all of their MPs, whether they're frontbenchers or backbenchers, what to say and what to think and how to vote on every issue. Whereas in the Green Party, we trust our elected representatives to make their own decisions and vote with their conscience.
That's a novel idea.
So we obviously share in the Green Party the same values and principles, and we all support the same policies, but we understand that an MP on a particular vote, something put forward by the government, might take a slightly different analysis to a colleague depending on how it affects their constituency, for example. So if I'm elected as MP for Bristol Central, I'll be representing those progressive, inclusive green values in Westminster, and I'll be free to stand up for the people of Bristol in a way that any Labour MP wouldn't be so able to do, because they have to follow the whip from the Labour leader's office.
Not having the whip, not being whipped, I guess is the correct construction there. That's kind of a luxury of being out of government, right? Like, if you wanted to govern, let's say the Green Party did have, a majority, you'd have to whip your MPs in order to get your business through the House of Commons, wouldn't you?
Well, the Greens are already in administration in over 10% of all the councils across England and Wales, including being the largest party, the lead party in quite a few of those now since our really great results in the local elections this May. And so no, it's not necessary to have a really domineering hierarchical approach to working with your colleagues in order to get things done. When we're making decisions, when I was a councillor on Bristol City Council, when we're making decisions about how we're going to vote, we'll have an honest, grown-up discussion about the pros and cons of voting different ways. The vast majority of the time the answer will be clear. We'll come to a conclusion and we will all vote a particular way, but occasionally there'll be one or two members who have weighed up the pros and cons of a proposal slightly differently and might vote a different way, and that's fine. That level of diversity of expertise, of lived experience and of perspective is valuable in politics, and I think that goes right back to the point about the strength of getting a few more Green MPs in Westminster. It's going to be a Labour government. Do you want a Labour government with a huge majority where they don't have much accountability and they don't have people challenging them, especially from a progressive perspective? Or do you want a Labour government with a handful of Greens who are going to push them to be a bit bolder, especially on policies around investment in tackling climate change, workers' rights, renters' rights, where they've been backsliding in recent years?
Let's talk about the manifesto. What's the moral case for raising taxes?
Well, the Green Party are really clear that the changes we need to make to our tax system to pay for good quality public services that benefit everyone, those changes need to focus on those with the broader shoulders who can most afford to pay. And so there are three main changes the Green Party are proposing making to personal taxes. The central one is introducing a wealth tax on the super rich. So we're talking only those with £10 million or more in wealth, and even then they'd only be taxed 1% on their wealth above 10 million, and then that goes up to 2% for billionaires. So that is something that those with that unbelievable amount of wealth could easily afford to pay, and that, alongside our other changes to capital gains and national insurance, which would only affect those at the wealthier end of society, would raise 50 to 70 billion pounds a year by the end of the next Parliament, and that would help to pay for improved public services, everything from the NHS to education to public transport, that benefits everyone, whatever your income.
You mentioned the wealth tax there. Also in the manifesto, scrapping tuition fees, nationalising water companies. Notably, and to strike the theme that you've been mentioning here, those are points of difference with the Labour Party. Not committed to any of those things. Why do you think it is that the Labour Party, which is traditionally seen as a progressive, dare I say, even left-wing party in Britain, hasn't committed to those same things that you have?
Yeah, the Labour Party has been drifting closer and closer to the Conservatives in terms of policies over the last few years, and voters are noticing it, and that's why many people across the country, but I can speak from my experience speaking to voters in Bristol, are done with the Labour Party. So many people I speak to on the doorstep who are voting Green for the first time in this election, they feel let down by the direction that Starmer has taken the Labour Party. Many of them voted Labour last time around, but they've seen U-turn after U-turn before the Labour Party has even got into government. If they can't even stick by their policies in opposition, what are they going to be like in government? And so they see the benefit of voting for the Greens, that we will stand by our policies, that because our policies are set democratically by our members at conference, one member, one vote, whereas the Labour Party, their policies are set in a less democratic way, where the leader can unilaterally veto any policies agreed on by their members that he doesn't personally like. So a high-profile version of that a couple of years ago is a fair voting system. There was a vote overwhelmingly in support of proportional representation for general elections at Labour Party conference, but because Keir Starmer doesn't personally agree with that policy because it benefits him electorally to stick with the current unfair first-past-the-post voting system, he's vetoed that, and that's not in the Labour Party manifesto. Whereas the Greens are clear that a fair voting system is an integral part of a fair society, and we would push the incoming Labour government to look at that very seriously, because you know the UK is one of only 2 countries in Europe that uses first past the post for general elections, and the other one is Belarus. Now, that's hardly a club that we want to be part of, and you know the reason for that is that the Labour Party is really adrift compared to its counterpart parties in other European countries. The Labour or Social Democrat or whatever they're called, the equivalent centre-left parties in all of the other European countries, they support proportional representation. They see that as an obvious, integral part of creating the fair society that they say they're for. But in the UK, they want to stick with the old system that keeps it like a club between the 2 old parties. We know that that's not what the majority of voters in the UK want. It's not what even the majority of Labour Party members want. And so the Greens will be pushing on electoral reform as well as on tackling climate change, tackling the cost of living crisis, sorting out the housing crisis, making it fairer for renters. Those are all areas where the Labour Party have, I think, fallen behind where public thinking is, and where the Greens, getting a few more Greens in there will help to refocus their minds.
The Americans use first past the post as well, don't they? They're doing all right.
I don't think many people are looking at the US electoral system right now and thinking, yeah, that's working really well, given that or Americans are looking down the barrel of potentially having a convicted felon in the president's office. So I don't think we should be taking any lessons from them.
It's democracy though, isn't it? Let's talk about party donations. The Labour Party, it would appear, transitioning to a more sort of private donor, big business type model, and some unions like Unite, for example, failing to endorse their manifesto, possible disaffiliation conversations happening. What do you make in the change of funding model for the Labour Party?
Well, first of all, on the opinions of unions towards manifestos, I've been really pleased to see support from some unions for the Green Party manifesto. The National Education Union, the Union for Teachers especially, put out a message strongly welcoming the Green Party manifesto as the only one that's being honest about the level of investment that's needed in education and the kind of changes we need to make sure that kids get the education they deserve and teachers can focus on providing the teaching that they need. And so that's great to see that level of recognition from professionals in the industry. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if some other unions come the same way, to be honest. In terms of funding, the Green Party is quite different to other political parties. We are absolutely a grassroots organisation, and so the vast majority of our funding comes from members and members of the public, Green Party supporters who want to put in a few pounds. It's generally very small donations, but they add up to help us run these fantastic campaigns. So if you'll forgive me a little plug, if viewers want to see more Greens elected, then they can find out how to do that on our website.
Any big private donors that donate to the Green Party?
We have a few slightly larger donors. I think nothing on the scale probably of the multi-millionaires and billionaires who are bankrolling the Conservatives and increasingly the Labour Party. But we do have some members who are, and supporters who are able to give a little more, and we're really grateful for their support.
On tax, I think a lot of people look at the manifesto interested, possibly even excited at the prospect of there being a degree of redistribution. Nationalisation of certain utilities, the same. Something that a lot of young voters care very deeply about is housing.
Yes.
The Labour Party has pledged to build 1.5 million homes in the next Parliament. The Greens have only pledged 150,000 social homes a year. Before we get into it, I'll give you the opportunity to sort of state the case for your housing policy.
Well, first of all, those numbers there, that's comparing apples with oranges, because the number you gave for the Labour Party is including houses built by the private sector. We're not giving a number for that because that's not something the government actually has much control over, and it would be a bit dishonest for the Labour Party to claim credit for houses that are built by the private sector without government support. And so the reason we're focusing on building social homes is because that's something the government can significantly influence, and it's something that's a priority because yes, we do need more homes in this country, absolutely, and the priority has to be building affordable homes that actually tackles the housing crisis. We need the right homes in the right place at the right price. Now, there is no single silver bullet for that. Just building more homes of any kind, of any price, anywhere won't fix the housing crisis. So there are a range of policies that together we believe in the Greens will help tackle this. That includes building a lot more social homes and giving councils the tools with which they can buy more properties off the private market and turn those into further council housing. We'd also give councils the power to introduce rent controls in areas like Bristol where the private rental market is completely overheated. The rise in rents in the city bear no relation to incomes. A one-bed flat has about doubled in rent in the 15 years since I've lived in Bristol, and let me tell you, incomes have certainly not. So we need to give councils the power to keep rent under control so that people can afford them. We also need to give councils the power to influence the private housing developments a little bit more to make sure that they are the right kind of homes that people need, the right size, the right price, and that come with the local services, whether that's local GPs, school places, bus services, that make it not just an asset but a home and a community for people to live in.
I accept your point, and it's an important one, that solving the housing crisis is not only an issue of supply. There are, certainly reforming planning, that's part of it, looking at rents, another part of it, and crucially, yes, you're right, council housing is a key part of it. However, the Centre for Cities estimates there's been a shortfall of 4.4 million homes built in the UK since the end of the Second World War when you compare us to our European counterparts. Quite simply, 150,000 council houses a year is not enough. It's a drop in the ocean compared to that. I mean, by their estimates, you need about 600,000 houses a year to get anywhere close to making up that shortfall. It's not enough, is it, 150,000?
And the private sector will be continuing to build housing as well. What the Green Party is offering that's different to the other parties is a real laser focus on making sure that the housing that gets prioritised by government and by local councils is affordable housing, because yes, there is a shortage of housing, yes, we need to build more, we also need to bring empty homes back into use and make it easier for councils to buy the supply. So here in London, many London borough councils are already using the buy the supply approach, buying a certain proportion of their council housing directly off the private market. The Green Party would support that and make it easier by giving councils first right of refusal on certain types of properties when they come onto the private market. So properties that were previously council, that were right to buy out of public hands. We would, by the way, also scrap Thatcher's right to buy policy, because that's basically a way of selling off council housing by stealth, and so we'd scrap right to buy, would replace it with this community right to buy, which give councils first dibs on certain types of properties when they come onto the market to bring them back into public hands. But as I say, we would also make sure that councils can influence housing developments from the private sector when they come in for planning application to make sure that they are meeting local need.
Is the presence of quite modest housing targets in your manifesto a product or something downstream of a through current, a tinge, shall we say, of degrowth politics?
I don't think that's true. I think our council housing targets are very ambitious, in fact, and they match or exceed the numbers that various housing charities have been campaigning for. Our priority is providing more social housing because that helps those at the very sharpest end of the cost of living crisis, and so that's our priority in terms of government action. But sure, there needs to be more housing in the private sector as well, and in the round that will help to tackle housing costs. You can look at where Greens have been in administration on councils to see how much we've prioritised housing. So, for example, in York, where the Greens had the housing portfolio for 4 years, they initiated and completed a number of housing projects, some of which were award-winning for the level of affordable housing and low-carbon housing that was built. And in Stroud, just up the road from me in Bristol, where Greens have been in the administration for more than 10 years, getting more housing built and more affordable housing in their area has been an absolute cornerstone of their strategy. And again, they've made substantial progress. I've been a housing campaigner for my entire political life. I'm a member of the Acorn Community Union and have been since before I first got elected as a councillor. So housing is a really big issue for me, and my focus is on helping those, especially renters, and nearly half of people living in my constituency of Bristol Central are private renters. There is currently an incredible power imbalance in the private rented sector, and our policies would seek to address that to make sure that everyone has access to an affordable, secure place they can call home.
A lot of Green councillors have campaigned actively against other housing developments. There's a recurring meme online, right, that the Greens are like NIMBYs, is what they get called.
So I'm aware that that's a Labour Party press release that you're quoting there.
It's not a Labour Party press release.
It's not actually based terribly in reality, though, if you actually look into the details.
Go on.
So we've got over 800 Green Party councillors across England and Wales now. Doing the maths off the top of my head, that means that in the last couple of years, Green councillors must have voted on thousands, if not tens of thousands, of planning applications for different housing developments. I've already given you a few examples of where Greens in administration have led on building more council housing, sometimes the first council housing for a generation in their council areas. Now, of course, with over 800 councillors making tens of thousands of planning decisions over the last few years, you will be able to cherry pick 3 or 4 or 5 examples of Greens voting against a specific planning application. When you look at the detail of that, you'll find that it'll be for reasons like the planning application didn't come with enough affordable housing, or there was a huge ecological impact of the development on that particular site, or the quality of the housing in terms of the amount of space or natural light in those flats isn't appropriate. And when you look into the examples that have been quoted in numerous interviews, that's always what's sitting behind it. Now, I am aware that the Labour Party are trying to use the label of NIMBY to attack the Greens, but it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny when you look into it. And in fact, it's very often the Greens that are leading on tackling the housing crisis where they're elected at local levels.
If I can assure you of anything, it's that I'm not a shill for the Labour Party, Carla. Just finally on housing, do you think on balance that Green councillors approve more housing developments than they block?
I don't have those stats to hand, but I'm almost completely sure that that will be the case. I used to sit on a planning committee for many years as a local councillor, and our priority was always to make sure that we were tackling the housing crisis, but it does have to be the right homes in the right place at the right price, because if we are approving an out-of-town greenbelt development of luxury 4, 5, 6 bed double garage homes that has the horribly energy efficient homes that will contribute to climate change, that are unaffordable for people that live in the local area and that don't come with the schools, GP surgeries and so on, then how is that meeting local need?
Elsewhere in the manifesto, ban on domestic flights in the UK?
For short journeys that can be done very easily by public transport, and that sits alongside a range of other policies, including a serious investment in public transport and subsidising it rather than subsidising aviation, which is what the government is currently doing. So, unbelievably, there is no tax on aviation fuel in this country. There's no VAT on most airline tickets, and on top of that, the government directly subsidises the domestic aviation industry. So that's specifically the short-haul flights that are over distances that could very easily be done by train. And yet, people sometimes feel forced into flying because the cost of an airline ticket is often many times lower than the cost of a train ticket for the same journey. Let's be clear, that cost difference is a government choice. That is because the government has chosen to subsidise short-haul aviation instead of subsidising public transport. Clearly, we're in a climate emergency. That's the wrong way around. And so the Green Party would immediately withdraw those subsidies for domestic aviation. We'd put them into public transport to make sure that the greener option is also the cheaper option.
If you're that committed to public transport, will you commit to building the rest of HS2?
The Green Party has ambitious plans for investing in public transport, and we support high-speed rail. The Greens did have some real concerns about the specific HS2 route, especially the leg between London and Birmingham, because that had some particularly bad environmental impacts. And I also was concerned that it risked just turning Birmingham basically into a commuter town of London rather than doing what really needed to happen, which is providing the infrastructure to connect the North and the Midlands properly. So I think, speaking personally for myself, my concern is HS2 having been stopped where it has exactly my fears are at risk of coming true, that we end up just turning Birmingham into a commuter town. We have all that environmental destruction that came with that first phase, and we don't have the infrastructure investment needed in the north of England. So the Green Party will prioritise pushing for investment to make sure that we build that capacity between cities in the north, and also holding the Conservatives to account, because they said when they scrapped the later phase of HS2 that money would be reinvested in transport. Now, what they didn't say in that initial press release is that much of that investment is actually being moved out of rail into road building. Clearly, in a climate emergency, when we need to improve public transport, that's not the right thing to do. And so whichever of us, how many of us get elected as Green MPs in the House of Commons, that is something that we will be pushing to get an inquiry into the Conservatives' mismanagement and making sure that the north of England still gets plenty of investment into its rail network.
Isn't the entire point of HS2 to free up the capacity on the rest of the rail lines, because you have the high-speed trains moving down this high-speed track? It means that you can run more local intercity regular services on those main lines rather than having the massive intercity trains running in between them.
So we certainly need to increase capacity on our rail network, however that's achieved, and whether that's with Northern Powerhouse Rail or whatever it gets badged as in the future, we certainly need to work on increasing capacity one way or another, and that's something I'll be focusing on.
Last couple of questions. So your manifesto pledges, I think it's £8 billion for the NHS in the first year. Total spending commitments I saw priced up by Sky News is about 162 billion quid. I mean, to be blunt, it blows Labour and the Tories completely out of the water. I think the Labour Party's pledged about 5 billion quid, Tories 13. The only party that has a comparable programme of either tax cuts, spending pledges is Reform, who are at about the same level as you. I think it's 150 billion pounds or something like that. Are spending commitments, tax cuts of that nature, are they a product of the fact that neither you or Reform have much of a chance of forming a government, and therefore you can offer people these manifestos that at the end of it are sort of pie in the sky Christmas list type proposals, because you're never going to be weighed down by the responsibility of government?
On healthcare specifically, the Green Party is the only party being honest about the level of investment that's needed. And we've seen that from responses from healthcare professionals who've welcomed the Green Party's policies, because while some of the promises that are coming out of the other parties, especially Labour and the Lib Dems, sound good in terms of what they're going to do with the NHS, in fact some of them are promising similar policies to ourselves, but on a fraction of the income, and it's just not realistic. So yes, we are talking about big numbers because that's what's needed. The NHS and other public services have seen decades of chronic underfunding, public servants not being paid properly, junior doctors and nurses seeing huge real terms pay cuts over the last 14 years. So yes, we do need to invest in our public services and in those who work in the public sector. And unlike the other parties, we're not afraid to talk about how we would raise that money by adjusting our tax system so that those with the broadest shoulders who can most easily afford to pay a bit more do, and that will raise tens of billions of pounds. That means that we can plough that into public services so that anyone, whatever their income, benefits.
On the point of my question though, I don't know, let's say something unexpected happens, a rupture, and British politics has been full of them for the last 10 years. You get a majority, you're in Downing Street and you look at the manifesto and go, oh my God, we've actually got to implement this stuff now. That wouldn't daunt you?
I would love to have a Green government. I'm realistic that it's not going to happen this time around. But yes, we've got a fully costed manifesto. We've taken expert advice from academics and organisations like the Wealth Tax Commission, for example, for that aspect of our funding, and other experts in their field. We know that the policies that we're putting forward are feasible. They are at the ambitious, the upper end of what's possible, but we're in a climate crisis, we're in a cost of living crisis, we have to be ambitious. And the fact, I think, that the Labour Party are being increasingly timid, that they're not willing to consider the changes that we really need to tackle these crises in the country, is why so many people are voting Green, because they want a few more of us Green MPs in Westminster to hold the incoming Labour government to account.
Carla Denyer, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.